The way this evening will run will be, we have a great panel, but we've asked them to keep their comments ridiculously short. So we have maximum time to make it a proper debate, including you. And so I will be using, although they are slightly improvised, don't look too close, I'll be using my yellow-red card technique. So when they have a minute left, they get a yellow card. When I want them to be quiet and finish the sentence and stop, they get a red card. The reason they already know this, I'm telling you this, because when we come out to you, if you suddenly feel that you actually need to deliver a 4-hour sermon, you will also get the yellow and the red card. So don't say you weren't warned. When I do come out to you, there will be roving microphones. And obviously, yes, if you don't want to be filmed, then just say, please edit me out, or just write your question or point down and give it to the person next to you and get them to do it. But we'll come on to that in good due course. What I'm going to do is introduce all 4 panellists, and then they will each in turn give us their 5-minute really opening thoughts. And then I may stand on my chair's prerogative to draw out a few points between us, but then I will come out and you will all get a chance, not just to ask questions, but to actually express opinions. So, our panel of 4 people. First of all, we're going to hear from Sana Oyampara. How was that?
That's very good.
Sana Oyampara, who's a researcher and doctoral student at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is part of the University of Oxford, and also here at the Alan Turing Institute. She is a Future of Work Fellow with the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the lead author of a report on the future of work, recently published by the Alan Turing Institute, which you can download for free online. So if you want to hear more about that, you download that online. And also co-convenes the Data and Equality Interest Group here at the Alan Turing Institute, and lots of other things, but I don't want to eat any more into her 5 minutes. Then we're going to hear from Naomi Clayton, who is Policy and Research Manager at a research organisation called the Centre for Cities, has responsibility for developing and overseeing their research programmes, including work on the future of work, and Deputy Director of the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. So the word work really appears a lot in your current job descriptions. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Keith Grimes, who is Clinical Innovation Director at Babylon Health and also a GP with nearly 20 years of experience, and an expert panellist on the Topol Review, which is an independent report on preparing the healthcare workforce for the digital future, and also lead of the Babylon Clinical AI Fellow Programme, which he will talk a bit more about, I hope, during his 5 minutes. And then finally, we're going to hear from Dr. Helen Hester, although she was at pains to say she's a different kind of doctor. So if you have any medical emergencies during the rest of the event, you should definitely talk to Keith and not Helen. If you have a philosophical problem, especially with techno-feminism, social reproduction and post-work politics, then definitely straight to Helen. So Helen Hester is Associate Professor of Media and Communication at the University of West London and co-author of After Work, The Politics of Free Time with Nick Cernick. So first of all, we're going to hear from Sana.
Perfect. So hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Sanna, and today I wanted to share a couple of thoughts about AI and the future or futures of work. So no, that's not a typo on the screen, but by the end of the talk you're going to see why I have used the plural futures here. So yeah, as Timandra mentioned, I'm the lead author of the report on data science, AI, and the future of work that I prepared together with my 2 co-authors, Neve and Mark, to inform the Alan Turing strategy around this area. So please feel free to go on the Turing website and download that one. So then to our topic of the day. When you look at the discourse on AI and its role in the workplace, you wouldn't really be blamed for thinking that we're in a sci-fi reality where intelligent machines either create a utopia or leave us behind in dystopia. Before we move forward, I wanted to remind you of one of the adventures of our friend Charlie Chaplin. Here he is in the movie Modern Times, which was released in the 1930s. And in the movie, he was actually facing somewhat of a similar situation of automation, just that the technology that entered his workplace wasn't AI, but was modern machines in this very state-of-the-art factory setting. And as you can see, poor Charlie kind of ended up being swallowed by the machine, so technological adoption had kind of a difficult outcome for him there. So fast forward to 2018 and us living through what's termed the fourth industrial revolution. So whereas Charlie was dealing with modern machinery and electricity, the fourth industrial revolution is characterized by a fusion of different technologies together, which then in turn blurs the spheres between biological, physical, and digital worlds. And if we then zoom into AI as a specific technology, the biggest difference to what's come before is that the focus is no longer on automating the mechanical, but rather on mimicking the decision-making of the human brain. So I'm sure that you have all seen this imagery kind of linking AI to the human brain. But actually, rather than modeling the brain, AI techniques take inspiration from the microstructure of the brain. And so while there have been many important advances in AI recently, they tend to be in quite narrow problems like image recognition or playing games, for instance. So general AI, the one that could perform any human action, seems to still be quite a long way away. So given that this is the kind of AI that we have, what does it mean for the world of work then? I'd like to offer you a couple of thoughts that emerged from this report that we wrote recently. So even if sometimes we see AI through these sci-fi lenses, AI and machine learning are already used in many sectors ranging from healthcare to finance and to even criminal justice. And these current AI technologies are likely to be most disruptive for routine tasks that are easier to be codified, while the tasks that require social intelligence or take place in uncertain environments are more likely to continue requiring human input. On the other hand, the deployment of AI technologies might also create new products and services and then also create new jobs. So as jobs are often made up of various tasks, it's quite challenging to estimate the volume of jobs that might be lost or created in response to AI. But even if we hear so much about AI, it's quite important to realize that AI is just one out of many new technologies, such as robotics, the Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, nanotechnology, and blockchain. And these technologies are kind of one set of what you could term as drivers impacting the future of work. And there are other drivers like demographics or trade or globalization and even climate change. So instead of seeing AI as this singular thing that in and of itself affects the workplaces around the world, we think it's quite useful to think about it as one piece within a set of complex dynamics between the drivers and then also in turn affected by the specific economic, political, and cultural contexts. So are we going to be in charge of the future in this world of work? Charlie certainly seems to be quite content once he got a hang of using his modern machine and kind of seems to be in charge there. If you look back into the history of technological change, in the long term, the introduction of new technologies has led into increasing productivity and wealth, as well as employment. But in the short term, before these population level benefits emerge, parts of the population have often been left worse off. So over the past few years, there has been also polarization of the job market, which is sometimes termed as hollowing out of the job market, where middle-income jobs that are the ones that can be more readily automated have started disappearing, and then high-income and high-skilled and low-income and low-skilled jobs have also increased. And on top of that, where AI takes over certain jobs, the profits from that work concentrate in the hands of the owners of that technology. And as a result, labor or workers might lose in terms of income, competition, or productivity. So one of the biggest challenges then related to AI in the workplace is understanding and addressing these emerging inequalities. And of course, a key mechanism to respond to some of these changes and manage them is governance and policy making, whether focusing on AI and new technologies or on the other areas of trade and taxation, for instance. So perhaps my point that I would like to bring into this discussion would be that it's not that AI is going to lead into a kind of certain and fixed future of work, but that many futures are possible. and depend on first understanding and also second on managing and responding to these technologies and the changes that they introduce to the nature of work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. They are admirably to time. Fantastic. Naomi, are you doing slides or are you just speaking?
No, I'm just speaking. Good evening. So, I mean, we're kind of primarily concerned with how all of this is likely to play out across the country and what the future of work will look like in different parts of the country. And if it is possible to kind of grow the size of the pie through investment in AI and robots, how can we ensure that everyone is better off as a result? Of course, there's been lots of debate about the impacts, potential impacts of the kind of rise of the robots, automation, and AI. But there's tended to be less focus on the geographical implications of all of this. Yet history shows us that technological development and its impacts are hugely uneven. So you look at the Industrial Revolution and the Lancashire mill towns, you look at laundry workers and domestic servants in parts of the southeast, changes in transportation and the decline of ports, and more recently, the rise of new work and kind of more knowledge-intensive activities that have tended to concentrate in the greater southeast. So different waves of disruption have had very uneven impacts on different parts of the country. And generally, we've been pretty bad at dealing with those impacts, as evidenced by the EU referendum, arguably. You know, whilst there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the changes that might be brought about by the rise of the robots and AI, we know that work that's been done by experts in the field shows that a lot of the jobs that are most at risk from these changes tend to be quite heavily concentrated in particular areas and particular parts of the UK. So if you look at AI and automation alongside some of the other big trends that are playing out, so globalization and demographic change, we know that the types of jobs that are most at risk from these big structural changes are things like warehousing, customer service, admin, and retail jobs. The types of jobs that tend to require slightly more basic levels of education, and those are, you know, essentially the types of jobs that are more exposed in terms of these changes. We also know from our work that these jobs tend to be more concentrated in particular parts of the country. So if you look at Mansfield, around 1 in 3 jobs in Mansfield are in these much more vulnerable occupations, compared to around 1 in 8 in places like Cambridge. But of course, as has already been said, there will be jobs created as these things play out. And while some jobs disappear, a lot more jobs will actually just change in nature in terms of the tasks that are done within these jobs and the skills required. So people often talk about ATMs and bank tellers. You know, you can also look at the example of assembly line workers. There are fewer workers on the assembly line now, but those jobs are much less about the kind of physical skills and actually assembling things, and much more about kind of maintaining and interacting with the machines doing that assembling. So, you know, there are lots of jobs that won't necessarily be wiped out, but many that will actually evolve in terms of the skill sets required by them. And indeed, we see that, you know, when we look at change over the last decade in terms of changing demand for skills, it's the changes within jobs that have been the most significant driver of changing demand for skills. I think crucially, the extent to which AI and some of these other developments are kind of human replacing or actually increase the productivity of humans really depends on the extent to which we're increasing skills in the workforce. But there's signs that we're not equipping people with the skills that they need for the future, particularly in some of the places that are most vulnerable to these changes. So if we start with young people and we look at the kind of picture of attainment across the country, we can see that there are big gaps that start before children even get to school. And those gaps in educational attainment persist, if not widen, through school. So if you look at kind of achievement in the early years and attainment in maths and English, which really kind of act as the kind of foundation for developing the kind of interpersonal and analytical skills that are growing in importance in the workplace. So things like negotiation, persuasion, complex problem solving. When we look at attainment in things like maths and English, which are fundamental to developing those types of skills, actually there are huge gaps in attainment across the country. Of course, it's not just what's taught in the classroom. It's about access to some of the extracurricular activities and work experience that helps young people to develop these types of skills. And we can see too that access to these types of opportunities is also very uneven. Of course, I have to just talk a bit about lifelong learning too. You know, with 2/3 of the workforce in 2030 having already been through compulsory education, it's vital that we think about continuous learning and access to adult education in terms of people's ability to adapt to some of these changes and develop the skills that are increasing in demand. And actually, there are signs that participation in lifelong learning are falling across the country in terms of participation in lifelong learning and job-related training. And actually, job-related training has fallen fastest in some of the areas that potentially could benefit most from it. And the lack of basic skills is an issue too. So, you know, an OECD study in 2017 concluded that in the next kind of 10 to 20 years, only workers with very strong numeracy and literacy skills will be more proficient than computers. But actually, when we look at literacy and numeracy amongst the adult population, we know that one in 8 adults lack basic numeracy, basic literacy skills, and 1 in 4 adults lack basic numeracy skills. And again, those are far higher in some parts of the country. And I think really the extent to which a lot of the changes that we've talked about result in kind of widening socioeconomic divides across the country really depends on the extent to which we manage to break down some of the educational and skills divides across the country. So that means that we need to invest more in education and skills, but we also need to give places and cities more flexibility in order to respond to some of the challenges that they face and experiment with ways to improve educational attainment and participation. And I think that's absolutely fundamental if we're going to ensure that the places that bore the brunt of previous changes don't do so again this time. So.
Thank you very much. So Keith, you're going to go back and do some slides.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Grimes. I'm a GP and I'm the Innovation Director at Babylon. Really terribly honoured to be invited to come along here and speak tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit, as things disappear from in front of me, about how we prepare the clinicians for the future of healthcare. So, if you don't know who Babylon are or what Babylon does, our mission is simple: to put an accessible and affordable healthcare service in the hands of everyone on Earth. And we do this by providing virtual consultations, video consultations, and clinical artificial intelligence services to help with information, diagnosis, and triage, and other services too. And we do this by using artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is helping us meet some of the challenges globally. Globally, there's a great demand for healthcare and a great shortfall in the supply of the clinicians to provide this care. And by working with artificial intelligence, and in particular developing those tools that allow us to address each of those specific problems, we hope to be able to meet that gap and not only make it more accessible, but more affordable, and thereby help people around the world. So how do we do this? Well, one of the typical things within artificial intelligence is you're going to see pictures of brains, and I have a picture of a brain here. It's not a realistic brain, but it helps you understand some of the basic approach to this. So the Babylon brain, the approach where we build these tools, models different sections of the cognitive function to replicate what doctors might do for their patients. So when you look at the fundamentals down here, you have the knowledge base, and the knowledge base is a knowledge graph that represents medical information, which is then used for the remaining product. We have natural language processing, representing the ability to understand what's said and what's seen, in particular the use of natural language processing with our chatbot. Then you have the user graph. The user graph is the memory. This is a representation of all the events that take place, accessible to not only the machine, but the doctors and nurses working for our service. We have the Inference Engine. This takes all this information that's provided by the users and helps identify what the causes of their symptoms might be, direct them to the right triage, the right place at the right time, and then help them with their treatment and recovery in future. And then finally, we have Health Check and Digital Twin. Health Check just launching next week. This is a way of taking healthcare advice and helping people understand better the potential causes of their illness going forward. So it's quite a big task that we're involved in this, and to undertake this is costing a lot of money. We're investing $100 million to create the world's largest and most advanced multidisciplinary team over the next 12 months. Now, I started in Babylon in June of this year, and there was about 320 employees. Now there's about 600. It's growing very fast. And we're bringing specialists. We're bringing data scientists. We're bringing engineers. We're bringing UX and user interface specialists to come and work with us too. And we're beginning to focus on things like chronic disease management as well. But the important thing is that we need clinicians. And the question is, where are all the artificial intelligence doctors? Maybe some of them are in the audience here just now, some of them are watching at home. The important thing is that we need domain specialists with expert knowledge to help us build this tool. So as mentioned at the start, I'm lucky enough to be participating in the Topol Review, which was commissioned back in December 2017 by our former Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. And he wants to prepare our health force to deliver the digital future. Led by Dr. Eric Topol, some of whom you might know, or some of you might know who this gentleman is, a cardiologist, geneticist, founder and director of the Scripps Institute in the States. And he is working to look at a number of different approaches to how we can prepare the workforce for the future of healthcare. So what are the technological developments that are likely to happen? How is this going to change the roles of the clinical staff? And then what's the implication of these changes? What skills might be needed? And what does this then mean about the selection, the curricula, education, training and development of clinicians working in the future? So we're looking 3 time periods, here and now, next 5 years, 7 to 10 years, and then 20 years hence, looking at genomics, digital medicine, artificial intelligence, and robotics. And if you're interested to read this, and I would ask you to have a wee look, the interim report is already available. It's available online. I can provide the links to anyone that needs this afterwards. There are 3 themes. Tonight we're talking about artificial intelligence, of course. And within this, we're looking at recommendations for clinicians to have a base understanding of these technologies, to understand ethics, to understand regulation and safety and the economics of this. And then also look at specialists, those working particularly in this area and working with the next cohort of people working in the future of healthcare, the data scientists, the clinicians of the future. Final report will be back in January 2019. So the good thing about this is that I get an opportunity to apply this within Babylon. And so what does this mean for Babylon? Well, we have the Clinical AI Fellowship. And this is a program that I've come in to help lead, to develop the digital doctor of tomorrow. So it's a one-year program, and we take doctors with an interest in this technology, with a clinical background, to come in and gain practical industry experience by learning about digital health and artificial intelligence and working with people that build this day by day. They act as subject matter experts, and this is why we draw them from general practitioners working on the front line, and they act to help deliver these digital healthcare services. So what's in this curriculum? Well, the curriculum starts with the fundamentals of artificial intelligence, data science, and statistics. And these are the core things that we may think will apply to all clinicians and healthcare workers going forward. Ethics, again, clinical AI governance, a new field looking at ensuring that we apply the highest standards in terms of safety and accuracy and regulation. Business studies, because of course these are people coming into a corporate environment, sometimes for the first time, and even for those that want coding. So I've moved through a bit quickly because I was really scared of getting the yellow card, but I'm very, very happy to answer questions when we come to the panel. So thank you very much.
Excellent. They didn't even let me reach for the yellow card. That's admirable. So, finally, yes, you see if you can keep up this good record of nobody getting it.
Yeah, I'm also very scared of the yellow card, so I'll try and go quite quickly. So I just want to start with a few brief comments about the current discourse around AI and what that discourse typically serves to conceal, namely good old-fashioned human labour. So we're kind of being sold visions of a fully automated post-work future on the basis of what is, in fact, a rather unsophisticated, labour-intensive present. So I'm going to start with an example that I think probably a lot of you will be familiar with, which is Amazon's Mechanical Turk, or MTurk. So MTurk describes itself as a marketplace for work that requires human intelligence. So it's an on-demand, elastic, global workforce that performs micro-tasks via Amazon's platform for minuscule, teeny-tiny payments. And so this can be stuff like classifying images or tagging objects in images, or things like audio transcription, stuff like that. Now, in the early days of MTurk, Amazon coined the term artificial intelligence, or AII, to describe this kind of activity. And articles in the mid-noughties, when it was sort of being launched, described MTurk as using humans to process information in a machine-like way. So the humans who do this work, who are known as Turkers, obviously kind of object to this framing to some extent. So Christy Milland, who runs an online forum for Turkers, notes that Amazon sells us as an algorithm. We are not even real human intelligence, we are fake intelligence. And now, crucially, Turkers are not permitted to automate large parts of the work they do. So the platform's acceptable use policy says that Amazon isn't averse to people using scripts or automated tools to preview and pick tasks, but these people are not permitted to complete tasks using automated tools, because then they aren't using their human intelligence to do the various jobs, and that's the whole point of MTurk to begin with. Recently, however, questions have been raised about who or what is performing tasks via MTurk. And this is particularly queries coming from academics and market researchers who rely on this service as a tool to gather huge amounts of data via mass surveys. You know, you reach a much wider sort of pool of data than you ever would, with the old-fashioned methods. And some researchers have started noticing repeated instances of survey respondents replying to questions in ways that really make no sense. Now, this could, of course, be due to people completing these tasks at speed. So, you're trying to get through them really quickly so you can get onto the next micro task and the next micro payment. So you just copy and paste things, just whack it in there. But it could equally be the result of browser extensions filling forms with random answers. So either way, there's this anxiety within research communities that these tasks are being performed by algorithms rather than by people behaving like algorithms. So in other words, we're seeing a rise in artificial intelligence, AI. So NTERC explicitly positions itself as a response to the gaps in AI. It's a means of addressing those areas where computers still lag substantially behind people. But not all companies are quite so upfront about the devalued human labour that's lurking behind technologically mediated repetitive tasks. So as Olivia Solon has recently remarked, it's hard to build a service powered by artificial intelligence. So hard, in fact, that some startups have worked out that it's cheaper and easier to get humans to behave like robots than it is to get machines to behave like humans. So you have some companies opting to kind of fake it until they make it, telling investors and users that they've developed a scalable AI technology while secretly relying on human intelligence. So there's quite a few examples of that we can possibly discuss later. And this phenomenon has been the subject of some critical interest recently, with commentators labelling things like photomation or Potemkin AI. For Astra Taylor, a general lack of curiosity about how the platforms and services we use every day really work means that we often believe the hype, giving automation more credit than it's actually due. In the process, we fail to see and to value the labour of our fellow human beings. We mistake photomation for the real thing, reinforcing the illusion that machines are smarter than they really are. And this clearly trenches upon sort of classic materialist analyses, which suggest that under capitalism, some of the qualities of object and subject come to be exchanged. But I won't go down that particular rabbit hole in 5 minutes. Now, many economists make a distinction between routine and non-routine jobs, and routine jobs are frequently kind of flagged up as being particularly automatable. But we must remember that what counts as routine has a history, and this is the history of forcing workers into increasingly tailorized work processes. So we're witnessing the continuation of familiar processes here, the process of workers being turned into robots so that they can be replaced by robots. But if the underlying dynamic here is pretty well familiar to us, the technologies at least still feel somewhat novel. For many people, the claims being made about AI, as well as its somewhat less impressive realities, are still pretty extraordinary. And this perhaps gives us an opportunity to ensure that these technologies do not become naturalized, that we don't come to a point where we just take them for granted. These are technologies to which we have not yet become inured, and which are therefore still visible as objects of critique, despite the tech industry's attempts to paint them as sort of preordained developments, inevitable and therefore irresistible. So I would say that we can't let AI or AAI or AAAI escape our notice. Thank you.
Excellent, and also escaped a yellow card. There you go, fantastic, well done panel. Well, there's some really interesting and a broad range of ideas coming up here, which is really nice. I think we've quite rapidly gone beyond, if you like, the obvious questions of whose jobs are going to go first and which skills do we need to teach people, although those are in the mix. But the much bigger picture here seems to be how does it change the nature of work to introduce AI? What are the other forces at play here? How are people going to change in relation to AI coming in the workforce? Or, in fact, is it much more about our perception of how work is changing than AI as a real force in how things are changing? I mean, I felt actually there was a little bit of a, thank you, by the way, for not trying to explain commodity fetishism in 5 minutes.
I thought it was rather too ambitious.
If anyone wants to talk about commodity fetishism and alienated labour, we'll be in the bar afterwards. But I did think there was a particular challenge here, in fact, to what Keith was describing as like kind of we're trying to do this now in a very practical way. And perhaps also relating to what you two were saying, this idea that actually maybe the things we're expecting AI to do in terms of replacing people or even replacing large parts of people's jobs is where we are still at the stage of imagining what it's going to be like. And in reality, what we get is just routinizing jobs while it's still cheaper for people to do them. How true do you feel this is, Keith? When we talk about an AI taking over the role of your doctor, or you're having a consultation with a chatbot. How close are we to really a computer can satisfactorily do that? And how much are we still at the stage of, actually, look, this is still a doctor, but the doctor has much more sophisticated algorithms to speed up routine processes?
Yeah. So I think that the latter is much more closer than the former. So the idea that artificial intelligence is going to be replacing the entirety of what a doctor or a nurse or another clinician might do for you in the very near future, I think is quite unlikely. And I think there's a number of different reasons for that, part of which are the technological challenges to do so. But part of it is because of the wide range of different skills and tasks that clinicians will undertake with a patient. And typically one of the things that you'll look and you'll say a doctor, one of the principal roles of a doctor is to be a diagnostician. And of course that's true, and so there's a great rush to the idea that you can replace a doctor's ability to do that. But of course, anyone who spent more than a few minutes with a doctor for personal reasons, for medical reasons, or actually, a doctor themselves will realize that a lot of the work you do isn't diagnosis. A lot of it is helping people understand the nature of the concerns, to help them with treatment, to make choices, to fulfill the role of a doctor in that relationship as well. And I think that's significantly further off. I think what will probably happen in the first instance is that artificial intelligence, the thing that I find most helpful is that it might help automate those things at the moment that feel most roboticized. And a lot of doctors will complain about this. The idea is that we're practicing much more algorithmically, even without having the technology there. So we're asking to practice to guidelines and the like. And having those guidelines personalized to patients is the sort of thing that artificial intelligence will be very useful for. So I think it will augment the clinician to allow them to provide better care. And the second thing that's always at the forefront of my mind is that if you can do this, if you can automate those parts that humans are ironically not so good at, then you free the doctor or the nurse or the healthcare professional to have more time to spend with the patient and then do that thing that is either uniquely irreplaceable or significantly harder for the AI to do. My worry is that as we make clinicians more efficient, is that we just pour more work on, we make more space and then we just pour more of that particularly complex work onto them. This is a concern that I hear colleagues articulate an awful lot, saying, I need those easy consultations to give me a break from the hard ones. But we're in a world where,
well, the robot will take the easy consultations and you'll only be left with the hard ones.
Yes, and that's one of the worries that people have. And I can understand where that might come from. The trick is to try and make sure that this isn't a set outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that there are different kind of ways that artificial intelligence can manifest itself. It's not a preordained disaster, it's not a preordained sort of utopia either. And with sort of the medical thing, there's this talk about polarization within the sort of automation of healthcare, health and social care work, of dividing it into sort of high tech on the one side, where you're dealing with these fancy machines and it's all super cool and there are really good wages, and then high touch on the other side, which is the traditionally feminized sort of grunt work of lifting, cleaning, tending the elderly. So the suggestion that this division is going to create an increasingly polarized healthcare workforce, and that it's going to entrench income and opportunity divisions in a really unhelpful way. But if you are thinking about, okay, how can we imagine the judicious use of the technologies that are coming into being? One sort of third term would be high talk, right? So the work that you're doing with people, could the use of technologies create greater space for that high talk work of engaging with people, reassuring people, making sure they understand what their diagnosis means, talking them through how to take medications in the best possible way. Could that be one way that we can imagine this as actually being a more positive step?
And that's certainly one of the priorities from Eric Topol in the Topol Review, that we free up time to care and allow people to do this. I think the trouble is that people will hear this and think, yes, I've heard this before in any number of different ways. I really do hope for it, because for me as a clinician, the time when I am at my best is when I am not thinking about serving the machine, I'm serving the person in front of me.
You raised this utopia, dystopia, disjuncture,
right.
but both of you kind of talked about if we have the real situation of the world of work now, and a lot of different forces at work in terms of getting us into the future. Is there a danger that AI is introduced as if it is a force, an independent force acting kind of inexorably on the world, and all we can do is really get out of the way or skill up to keep the wheels moving? Whereas actually some of the things that are going on are completely not about the technology, but by making the technology the thing that's there in the foreground, in fact, other things have slipped in, like de-skilling and turning the people into the robots. Either of you, I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on this. The kind of the danger that actually we're looking at the AI, and while we're looking at that, other things are happening under the cover.
Yeah, I feel like, at least based on the research that we did for the report at the Turing Institute, it does seem that oftentimes it is exactly kind of depicted as if it's a very clear singular force that is kind of difficult to deal with, difficult to understand, keeps evolving before you can understand what it was the day before. And oftentimes it really can come down to basic policy making around taxation, around trade, around just regulating and understanding better what's happening. And yeah, sometimes it feels that the discussion is moving away from that kind of very practical work that could be easily taken and kind of then used to shape the future that you want to have for your country and for your sector and for the area that you are working with. But something that I was thinking just now that you were talking about kind of the leading sectors and where AI is getting introduced is that, again, based on some of the research that we did, it seems that in the UK and perhaps even in many of the leading industrial countries, it is still quite narrow where AI is kind of actually usefully deployed, and there is a business case for that. So, of course, you have the tech industry, automotive, perhaps finance, but beyond all of that, it's kind of narrow where you can be using it. And something that happens with AI, right, is that you need to have that wealth of data. Like in your brain, you had the section on knowledge and knowledge base. And if you have that, you will keep on building better and better and better algorithms. So what's happening is that if you look at, of course, the tech giants, they are using AI across multiple functions, multiple departments, and are able to be playing in a very different playground than others that come after that. So that's also something really important to think about in terms of the inequalities, that you might have that advantage if you kind of start early and start thinking about this early.
And is it a field where, I mean, we hear this about China, that the great advantage China has is they have immense data sets. Other advantages like relatively few ethical considerations and little sense of privacy, but they have very big data sets, and therefore the AI can develop really quickly. Is this something that's going to benefit really very large companies and organizations and make it very hard for small ones to get a look in?
Yeah, I think to some extent that is certainly the case, because you are looking at the data as an input that you need to have, as well as just pure investment. And if you even look at the numbers of investment into AI or into robotics, AI is still kind of a small area of that money. So yeah.
I think the point about not thinking about AI in isolation is a really important one. I talked about our research has looked at these changes in the round alongside demographic change, globalization, all of which are continuing to impact on the world of work and on places. I think it's important to think quite carefully about how these changes are going to impact on jobs and work, and they will have quite different impacts, but it is important to consider them in the round. And I think that the point about getting some of the basics right is absolutely fundamental. I mentioned, clearly there have been a number of different changes in the workplace and in the economy that have impacted on work and the jobs that we do, and that have had very different impacts on place. And part of the reason that we are where we are and we see such big disparities across the country is that we haven't got some of those basic things right. So,
are we missing an opportunity to actually introduce technologies like AI and robotics more quickly into existing industries. I mean, I hear a lot about the productivity gap, and that one of the reasons our economy, along with many other economies in the world, is very slow growing, is because we have this productivity gap. And I wonder whether actually if we were a bit more bold to introduce things like automation and AI, then we could make those industries more productive, and that might get the economy moving in those areas.
Yeah,
Should we be a bit bolder, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, there is certainly an argument that part of the productivity kind of challenge in the UK is precisely because we're not investing enough in technology and AI and the robots. But of course, yes, whilst there is certainly that argument, we need to make sure that we are equipping people with the skills that they need to complement those investments.
Okay.
I have a couple of explanations for the productivity gap, right? So one of them is that this technologies take sort of a really long time to be integrated into businesses and to be taken advantage of. So you could think about things like driverless cars. You don't just invent the driverless car and boom, it's ready to go. You need to make lots of substantial changes to infrastructure, you need new laws, you need to change basic human habits about how you move yourself around. And you see this as well with stuff like driverless trucking. Like, it may be possible to have the technology that will do that, but at the moment you still need a person because they're the people, the drivers are the ones offloading the trucks at the other end. So you still need a human being in the kind of the chain there. But the other is that there's kind of, the economy is sort of polarizing. I know you sort of gestured towards this in your talks, between sort of high productivity firms and low productivity firms. So, when we take the average, it seems like there's not much going on. It seems that we've got quite low productivity growth. But then you look at companies like Ocado in the UK in particular, but Amazon and Google and so on, and there is a lot of automation happening. So it's just that they're at the sort of leading edge of a trend, and the average then is quite low. And you mentioned China, and I think there you can really see that they are purchasing a lot of industrial robots at the moment, and they're surging ahead, which suggests that they're about to go into sort of a period of rapid automation in the manufacturing sector. So it's like globally unequally distributed, this sort of these ideas about productivity.
Okay, I would like to come out to the audience and, whoa, look at those hands. We're going to turn the lights up and the hands are going up. So could we have a little bit more light on the audience? So we can just check they're all awake. No, so we can see where the hands are. And we have a microphone there, another one hiding behind the pillar. Okay, so if you'd like to, there's a hand or just almost right behind you there. If you'd like to do that, and can you get that microphone to here? So we'll come to you second. So as I said, we're filming. So if you don't want to be filmed, either say edit this out or keep your head down and disguise your voice, because we're filmed to the back. So you're right. If you pretended you were going for a night out with the boys and then you snuck off to a data debate, we've all done it, then just as long as you disguise your voice, you'll be fine. And I'm going to take 3 or 4 points at a time so that the panel can all get stuck into all of them. So off you go.
Hi. While we are rushing towards, the introduction of artificial intelligence through many different forms, that you've got blockchain, digitization, IoT, etc., etc., etc. And while I'm all for all of that, the big issue that I have is around people. Because when you talk to the CFOs for many of the organizations that will be making the investments into AI, their issue is around productivity and how does it reduce the overall cost of whatever is the good product service that's finally delivered. So once the technology reaches that tipping point where it actually is able to deliver, people no longer matter. It's all around the next generation of the technology, the next update, the next solution. And people don't stop coming. We've got universities that are churning out more and more people, and we're talking about how do we skill them. But the question is, skill them for what? Because if their current jobs are being replaced by machines, and those machines are being trained to do more, what do you need people for? And that's my big concern, is that while we shouldn't drive forward and automate, and I'm more for automation, which is, in my view, technology to help people to do their job better, versus digitization, which actually is replacing the people who are doing the job. My question is, what are we going to do with the ever-increasing pool of people who no longer have something to do.
Great, very good key point, thank you. And you have the microphone there, so keep putting your hands up and then we'll get the microphone right to you. Yeah.
So my question relates to whether or not AI will make us more honest at work and in society. And I'll give you an example that I read yesterday. I read about a new EU trial in Hungary where they're testing virtual border agents, that when somebody turns up at border control, this virtual agent will interview them, ask them questions, but there'll be a camera which will be monitoring micro gestures on your face and determining whether you're lying about, what you intend to do in the country, etc. And if the machine detects that you're lying, passes you to a human agent for further interrogation. Now, I'm thinking about healthcare. What does it mean with video calls? So could the doctor tell that you're lying over the phone because the AI is telling the doctor in real time? What does it mean for meetings with your colleagues when you're having a team meeting and then the manager afterwards consults the AI and it says 7 out of your 10 team members were lying to you? What does it mean when you're stopped by the police and you're speaking to the body camera that's recording you and you're saying, no, I wasn't speeding, blah, 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 and the police officer knows by the AI this person is lying? What does that mean? Does it mean that we will all be forced to become more honest when we're working and when we're dealing with
That's a great vision. I just like, while we move the microphone to whoever is next, which I think might be that person there. Hand up properly. Come on. Yeah. Someone at the back has got the microphone, I know. I just want to take a little straw poll. Who would welcome a world in which the AI can tell when we're lying? One guy at the back, although even then, I'm not sure if you're asking a question. You would welcome that world, yes. So there's one honest guy at the back. If anyone wants a really honest opinion or anything, it's that guy at the back at the end of that row. All the rest of us, and I include myself in this, like to have a bit of dissembling going on. Excellent point, question, whatever it was. OK, somebody at the back has the microphone. Who is it? Yes, go ahead.
It was back in 2003, perhaps 5 years ago, that Carl Benedict Frey and Michael Osborne kicked off this whole debate, let's say, about automation of jobs, and they predicted within a decade about 45% would be automated. We're 5 years into that decade now. What's the progress been on that?
OK, so how many jobs will be automated? Very good question. And they would take your question, and then I'll let the panel come back in her word. Yeah.
It's really a comment, actually. I mean, the
Good.
person earlier who was saying about the CFO just being concerned about efficiency, there's a lot of work going on at the moment in the financial services industry around the ethics of AI and responsible technology. And if you work in the financial services industry, they have to be accountable to the regulators. So, for instance, if they introduce AI technologies and there's a decision made using AI that, for example, someone can't gain any credit, then it simply won't be satisfactory for them to turn around and say, well, the AI said you can't have any credit, so therefore you can't. They're going to have to be able to explain this, otherwise they will get into trouble with the regulator. One of the ways in which companies are beginning to consider how they make AI more manageable and understandable is they're looking at human overview of AI and human review of AI. So it's simply not the case that AI is just about efficiency without human beings. Some of the latest thinking is that human beings will have to be involved in the review of AI processes in order for them to be explained.
Excellent, very good point. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to come back to the panel. Obviously, don't all feel you have to answer everything, but chip in on whatever you would like. So just to recap slightly, we've got the question of, OK, all this productivity is great, but then what do you do with all the people? And if we're reskilling them for what? The question of whether AI will make us all more honest. And if any of you think that would be a good thing, that would be really good to hear from, because it's really very popular in the audience. Are we any closer to knowing how many jobs are going to be lost? Is it still looking like 45% of jobs, or does anyone have another figure to throw around? I've heard various different ones. And the idea that we're going to have a human in the loop, if only for accountability. So who'd like to chip in on what?
Could I maybe start actually with the Frey and Osborne paper? They're from Oxford, so maybe I'll move on that. So yeah, that was actually something really interesting that we also featured in the report as kind of like a specific section on automatability or computerization of jobs. And so that paper kind of kicked off the discussion and led to various papers that use the same methodology but arrived at quite different numbers because maybe we're not using the US as a case or had like different data sets. And then there was another set of papers that kind of broke this into more specific tasks and then the numbers really drop down into around 10% or even less for a lot of like OECD economies in particular. I don't know if you saw the British Academy and Royal Society review that recently came out on the impact of AI on the future of work in the UK. And they kind of synthesized a lot of these papers as well for the UK. And I think what they arrived to was that between 10 and 30% of UK jobs would be automatable by AI. So I think that that's kind of an interesting number and discussion that I would maybe go by. Do you mind if I'll actually respond to another one?
Yeah, go for it.
So in terms of the first question that was being asked, yeah, at least based on our research, it seems like kind of cognitive interpersonal skills are the ones that will be quite hard to automate and that would be quite beneficial for human workers to still keep using across a variety of different tasks and sectors, as well as specific skill combinations. So it seems like that might be an area where the retraining could be quite helpful, but then I suppose the reality of the retraining as well is that you might not be able to catch everyone because of different life situations, so you might then want to look into other types of solutions like social safety nets for those that couldn't be completely retrained. But yeah, it's a very challenging question, and I hope that there would be more policy attention, growing policy attention into all of that area.
Did you want to come?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about the kind of financial safety nets. And of course, there's big debate about the kind of role of universal basic income in this space too. And, you know, there are lots of different views on that. I think it's worth noting that, you know, technology in the past has created more jobs than it's destroyed. There of course is a debate about, you know, whether this time it is different and whether AI is really going to change things fundamentally. I think I agree. The study that kind of we looked at, which kind of builds on Frey and Osborne's work, that they did kind of further work with Nesta, found that around 1 in 5 jobs are in occupations that are at risk of being displaced through these changes. But of course there is variation. But yeah, I think, you know, there is a big debate about, you know, how many jobs are going to be displaced and what people are going to do in the future. And I think, you know, kind of links back to, you know, in the short term, we tend to overestimate the impacts of these sorts of things and technological change. But in the long run, we underestimate the impacts of these things. I think, you know, we've got to not let a lot of these debates distract from actually trying to sort out the things that we need to get sorted now. Going back to some of the points that I was making about the kind of education and skills system, there are some fundamental issues that we need to address there, really.
Keith, I wanted to particularly ask you about this point on honesty, mainly because I'm now basically terrified that at some point I'll only be able to interact with my GP through some kind of screen. And when I say, yeah, I drink about 14 units a week, I am apparently the only person I know that actually tells the truth to my doctor about how much I drink. I didn't realise that you routinely double it when you write it down, so more for me. So is that going to be, our doctor's going to be screening me for the honesty of my answers when they examine me in future?
Of course, the truth of it is that it won't be facial recognition, it'll be the micro tremors in your hands that we pick up from the smartphone. So you could wear a mask and we would still know. I think, I mean, the question of honesty is really, really important. You know, I've worked in a lot of different roles, and you know, one of the most challenging things I found was working in a prison. I used to work in a prison as a prison doctor, and you realise at that point how much you, as a doctor, you rely on honesty to allow you to do your job. When sometimes you're working with people that maybe aren't quite as honest, and that was very interesting to me. But I think what was interesting about it, the question was about whether facial recognition technology might actually allow people to tell whether you're lying or not. But what's more interesting to me, and you know, Babylon, we're working with facial recognition technology, or at least begin to look at how we might be able to use it. What's interesting to me is 2 things. Number one, machine vision is more sensitive than humans at detecting changes in facial expression. number one. But the second thing is when there's a disparity between what the person is saying and what they're thinking. It's not that I want to know that they're lying and that's wrong, but there's significance in that has, for a clinician, perhaps a person who has depression saying, how are you getting on? And they're like, oh no, I'm fine, everything's okay. But if you know otherwise, and if this is an appropriate piece of information to handle, it can be really powerful in terms of assisting you to help that person in a sort of a therapeutic relationship. So there are benefits there as well. And then the second thing to say as well is that if you can quantify an emotional response, it allows you to establish a digital continuity of care as care becomes slightly more fragmented because of the fewer numbers. If you could say this person is 40% sad one week and then 50% sad the next and 60% sad, in an objective manner, it actually allows you to more accurately understand how they're responding to treatment. So all this has to be done with patients' understanding and consent, but these are extra tools to help you help people.
What do you think about this vision of the future of healthcare, that we're going to be tagged as 41% sad this week, and 57% sad the following week?
I think it's a rather unnuanced take on inner life, isn't it? That it can be quantified in such broad terms. I think actually, there are many different variations of sadness, some of which are actually quite desirable. They're part of allowing things to resonate with you as a human being is to maybe be capable of melancholia, even if from a Freudian perspective, it's pathological. Sometimes we like the things that are sad or bad or not the best for us.
But of course, what I'm not saying here is that people aren't allowed to be sad. Anything.
No.
It's about.
It's just you're going to put a numerical value on exactly how sad we are.
Yeah, that's exactly.
To be honest,
right,
I find that more depressing. I think if I walked in and the doctor said, yes, your reading here from how fast you've been typing on your phone says you're 37.9% sad. I go, well, you can dial that up by 10% right now. The very fact you're doing that makes me 10% more sad.
What is really interesting is that similar discussions were held by clinicians about the introduction of thermometers. Back in the 1700s, there was a great article about this recently. They were talking about how physicians at the time railed against the introduction of thermometers because it took away the healing touch, the touch of being able to feel a temperature, and how there's a different quality of a temperature felt by the back of a hand as opposed to a mercury thermometer. And of course, mercury thermometers back in the 1700s were as long as my arm and, took ages to read. But it's now incorporated into our practice. I'm not saying it's used for absolutely everything, but it opens up that opportunity to understand our patients in this case, and understand and come to a common understanding of a person's experience. You may think it's self-evident that a doctor might be able to look at someone and tell whether they're happy or sad and be emotionally intelligent to understand this. I speak as a person who's probably not as emotionally intelligent
I
as
know
other people,
doctors,
and I've had my moments too, yeah. So, I don't even think that we can rule out the possibility that we can use artificial intelligence to help augment a person's emotional intelligence down the line. That doesn't mean that we should be using it to replace it.
Yeah, I think the issue is one of agency, right? And I think patients need to have the agency to disclose what they wish to disclose to their practitioner. And that's kind of brings us back to this idea of honesty. And I thought that was a very provocative question, whether, is it still honesty if it's something that is compelled from you? Can we still even frame it as being honesty? And personally, I think automated border agents are a terrifying idea, but then I think border agents in general are a terrifying idea, and the carceral state itself is a terrifying idea. But it reminded me of, there's this writer, Jathan Sadowski, who came up with this phrase, Potemkin AI. And one of the examples that he draws on is image recognition for police surveillance that's going on in China. And this is particularly one of the things where it seemed to be a very slick interface. The idea is that it's all kind of Minority Report, you're being assessed all the time, you can't escape. But actually it's still, people in a room trawling through footage, trying to find it, and then presenting it as if it's a slick interface with no kind of interference. So, I think we need to remember that, this cognitive labor is still coming from a building full of low-wage workers, probably. And then the question that came, the first one, about sort of surplus populations and what's happening with the transformation of the labour market and the people who are getting churned out of places like I work universities. I think it's really important to remember that none of these technological changes that we're talking about are a fait accompli. You know, they have to be framed as a matter of political struggle. And, you know, so one of the more, so UBI has been mentioned as one of the things that's coming up as a way of dealing with this. UBS, so Universal Basic Services, is another. But my own sort of preferred way of talking about it is in terms of the shorter working week. So, you know, the shorter working week is on, you know, it has been shown in some exploratory studies to increase productivity. So, you know, it is a business-friendly kind of idea. But it's also more meaningfully, could it be a way of redistributing both the burdens and pleasures of work over a broader subset of the population? So, you know, there's lots of terrible work that I'm sure people would like to be, you know, emancipated from in terms of, you know, wouldn't it be nice? I think there was an Onion heading that was along the lines of, you know, oh, low-paid worker in Foxconn, you know, wishes their job had been automated already so they didn't have to do it, you know. But yeah, so I think, you know, there's terrible work that, you know, we need to distribute more fairly across a wider subset of the population. But there's also jobs like mine where, you know, there are huge numbers of PhDs who are coming out the other side hoping to get academic jobs. And there are more PhDs than there are positions. You know, there's a real glut of very talented early career researchers who've got nowhere to go. You know, if my job was on a shorter working week, and somebody else could step in and do half of my role, you know, then you're actually, the job work that gives us a sense of meaning, that makes us feel connected to communities, that makes us feel that what we're doing is important and gives us a sense of purpose, can that be distributed more fairly via a mechanism like the shorter working week? But I mean, the main point, I think, is to think in terms of people, not profit, when we're talking about these technologies, which I think is a framework that you've kind of gestured towards in terms of Babylon and what you guys are doing.
Right, I'm going to come out and whoa, look at those hands go. Okay, so we have about half an hour left, so we should get through a lot of points. If I can ask you to be as concise as you can, and then I'll try and get the panel to address everything. We have a hand sort of, well, there's one behind you as well, so we could start there and then go backwards. And this one, can I see where the hands are? Okay, so we'll start there and then again go backwards. Okay, yeah.
My question is more about the lifelong learning and the kind of, I wonder about the AI application to that, because there's this plethora of online learning facilities like Lynda, edX, and I've taken part in lots of them all the time. But then there's also many different categories of how we learn. So is it kinetic? Do we learn visually? Do we learn orally? And there must be a massive database out there. And is this a way of kind of ensuring lifelong learning, or kind of pushing it forward by using the AI that's kind of taking away from these jobs to help push that education?
So AI could actually do some of the re-education and the retraining.
Or just like to figure out how people learn is very importantly as well.
Okay, very good point. Thank you very much. So if you'd like to pass that one, I think, yes, just forward. And somebody has the thing over here. Yes, go for it.
A question about sort of one of my favourite groups from history. We talked earlier about the fact that we're in the 4th Industrial Revolution. One of my favourite groups were the Luddites. I think that they're very underappreciated. But I'm wondering, because Sana spoke earlier about the Googles and the Amazons of the world who are really driving this forward by having this cross-platform approach. I know that we're having the debate here as a small group, but is there a possibility that there's a group that will stop us, and even like the doctors with the thermometer, is there a group that will stop us and make us look around and determine, is there a mechanism for putting people before profit, or is it moving too quickly for us to have control with Googles and Amazons having such a huge part of that pie? Are there Luddites, and if there are Luddites, do they have any power to make us think?
Perfect, thank you very much. Maybe you'll have to start it in the bar afterwards. So you have the, and is that good? Okay, so we'll go to you and then over to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Mine's kind of related to the last point. We keep saying it's not preordained, all this AI stuff. But I think for some people it is preordained. If you're out of the scientific community, if you're like me and you don't understand computers at all, or you come from communities where your education system doesn't have the resources to give technology, or you come from communities, I think specifically Naomi spoke about it, sort of communities where this doesn't reach it. How do we get those communities and those people who wouldn't understand AI or don't have the opportunities to understand AI to be part of this and not have it be preordained for them? Because I think that will massively impact our future divide, which I think everyone's pretty much spoken of, that increasing chasm between groups.
Excellent and very well put, thank you. Could you get that microphone over to the one guy who wanted to be honest? And meanwhile, good, you have a microphone, good.
Hello, I'm quite sure that AI will change the way we work. I'm just not sure how it should happen. Like, I'm kind of afraid that AI will make the richer more rich and the poorer poorer. And I think that's a process which is not really in favor of how the world is seeing AI. And so, I mean, at the moment, the EU is not even capable of taxing electronic services. How should they be capable of taxing AI and doing it a proper way that the poor will get their share of the cake, and not only the rich people and the people with capital will profit from it?
Another very good point, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to go over to that guy over there, and then I'll give the panel another chance, but I will come back out. Yeah?
Hi, my question's about, is there an underlying contribution to the shifting attitudes, in particular attitudes that diminish the signaling value of work and the monetary benefits that it provides? Is there an underlying contribution to that in the future of work? Or in other words, are we overestimating the scale at which AI is going to disrupt the future of work? Or is it just that people are changing how they view monetary benefits of work?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Are you saying actually work will just become less important because AI can do it? Or is it more specific than that?
I think I'm saying that the monetary benefits of work increasingly start to look smaller and smaller as more time is spent online and more of human life is lived online. So the gap between what you make, the gap between higher income and lower income has lesser consequence signaling value. And so does that contribute to a switch in attitudes? And is that contributing to the future of work and the dismantling of the future of work?
Okay, really good and excellent, big question. So, panel, we have, most of these questions are kind of now converging around, okay, well, we say it's not inevitable, but for a lot of us, there's not actually anything we can do about it. And where are today's Luddites, who I agree tend to be rather typecast as backward and anti-technology, whereas they were a bit more specific, like, we have quality work here and you're going to take it away. So where are today's Luddites, or do we need them? How are we going to deal with this divide that's opening up? Is there a role for governments or supranational bodies? Is it taxation? Is it regulation? What can AI, in fact, play a positive role in lifelong learning and training? And zooming out a bit, maybe, are we just going to change our attitude to work as lots of things become available to us very cheap or very free even? Are we just going to go, well, okay, I don't have a job, but it doesn't really matter? By the way, we keep using the phrase UBI. Is everybody comfortable with what UBI means, universal basic income? No, sorry, it's a jargon that comes up a lot in these debates, so I let it pass. It's universal basic income is the idea that regardless of whether you're working or not, somebody pays you enough to live on. So it's a kind of universal non-means tested welfare. And the universal basic services idea is like that, but not cash, that everybody has all the basic things they need to live. And then if you have a job and work, that's on top. So apologies for not picking that up. So who would like to chip in on any of those massive questions?
Set of really good questions. I think on the kind of point about lifelong learning, I think absolutely we need to look at the kind of opportunities that are created through kind of AI and technology more generally to kind of deliver and support lifelong learning. But I think we also need to think about the people who may not be aware of the opportunities and the kind of the benefits that lifelong learning might bring. So I think there's something in trying to create more of a culture of lifelong learning and looking at the mechanisms and kind of levers through which we might do that. And I think that links into the question about how we get communities to be part of this and ensure that places and communities aren't left kind of further behind. And I think the kind of whole, as I've said already, kind of education and lifelong learning is a really important part of that. And I think clearly in terms of the role of government, national and local government, I think, there's nothing inevitable about the way these changes will play out and the impacts that they will have. A big part of how this will play out is dependent on how we deal with these issues. And I think, and I would say this because I'm from an organisation called Centre for Cities, we do think that there is a really, really significant fundamental role that local government and local stakeholders can play in trying to deal and kind of grapple with some of these issues in ways that support better outcomes too for local communities. And then I think there's, we've talked about kind of polarisation of employment and the fact that, generally over the longer term, our economy, our labour markets have been polarising between kind of high paid and low paid jobs. And in many ways that's set to continue because, there will be jobs that AI and the robots are bad at doing, and they will be at the kind of high end and the lower end of the income distribution. So I think, going forward, we need to be kind of thinking about the role of collective bargaining and trade unions and also the kind of broader ways that we can support people, particularly on low incomes, to manage cost of living, essentially.
Okay, good. Helen, do you want to?
Yeah, there's a bunch of really good ideas kind of lurking around there. The lifelong learning thing, and sort of the online learning and the MOOCs and everything. Most studies, which are admittedly done by academics, suggest that students feel more engaged and do better when they're working with people. But maybe we're just afraid of, writing ourselves into obsolescence as a sector. I think there's a couple those sort of joined together questions about Luddites and then how we resist. I think those are really, really important and crucial questions. So last weekend I was in the Netherlands giving a talk at an art gallery with a bunch of people about an exhibition. And one of my co-speakers was a politician, and she was basically talking about the regulation of AI. So she's involved in a lot of EU working groups, involved in putting out working papers, proposing regulation and all this kind of stuff. And of course it felt very, very, analog, a very analog response to a very digital problem, where it seemed very slow and very cumbersome. And, obviously she was just working within the framework of her role and what she could do. But it obviously felt like these transformations were continuing apace and deliberately trying to outpace the regulatory frameworks. So by actually manifesting things in the world before regulation, the regulation is then on the defensive and is trying to respond to a situation that already exists, rather than trying to shape the landscape into which these technologies emerge. Part of this is potentially about innovation and who innovates. So thinking about the entrepreneurial state, who makes things, who creates things, who owns things, how much of the research that is kind of underpinned by public spending and work that goes on in universities just gets co-opted and enclosed essentially by corporations and companies. I think it's really important to have discussions and figure out ways to resist that. But the other thing is, again, one of the things I keep coming back to is maybe these huge, fast, shiny, pacey developments within AI that we keep seeing and hearing about aren't as fast or as quick or as nimble as we like to imagine. Because obviously, it's in the interest of the companies who are making AI and promoting AI to suggest that they can do things or are on the verge of being able to do things that they can't. It makes them seem like a more investable proposition. And in the course of the discussion at this art gallery, it became apparent that somebody had been to a cybersecurity firm that was trying to do cutting edge, use AI to protect businesses' online interests. And they were looking at what they had, which they had set up this super luxe marketing suite with these huge, slick black screens. And when they asked, what do the screens do? You know, what they thought. No, what do they actually do? They didn't do anything. It was set decoration. You know, a huge amount of money is going into the marketing, this form of set decoration of what AI might be in the future. And we're being sold this idea that it's already happened. So this is what I'm kind of getting at with the idea of resisting the fact that it's preordained. Because people want us to think it's done. You know, they want us to think that we're just waiting for these things to emerge. And they're not, you know, we, a group of people are behind this. Humans are making these things. They're making decisions about them. And we need that process of denaturalization, de-inevitabilization, makes these technologies seem far more up for grabs. And in terms of how we resist that, I think a lot of energy is coming from the grassroots. I think we're now thinking potentially in terms of things like techno-Luddites. So you're taking the energy of resisting forms of technology that strip us of our autonomy, but you can resist technologies, and you can resist through and via technologies. They can be a tool for doing that. They can be a vital tool in organising. And I mean, I could go on about the feminist use of technologies. It often gets overlooked, but there's a long history of women using technology to radical ends, queers and trans people using technologies for radical ends that I could really dig into. But we can we can use technologies as part of our resistance rather than just resisting the technologies themselves.
Excellent. Keith?
Oh, you're not going to ask me to follow that.
Yeah, come on. So come on, all this shiny stuff, you've got the pictures, the brains of that, it's just set dressing. Isn't it? What you've basically got is an overworked GP going, well, come on, I know, it's 90% likely you've got the same as all the other people that come in my thing, so I'm going to prescribe you statins and see if you're dead in a year.
Oh, hey, statins. So trying to find a non-anvilicious way to segue from that brilliant discussion there about, you know, how you know, people can have control over how technology is used when it affects their life. You know, I can't challenge that. It's interesting about, you know, the recurrent use of the word resistance, and you know, it comes up as my recollection is, you know, I'm not a fan of Ned Ludd, was that his name? Ned Ludd? Yeah. He broke the machines, did he not? And
breaking the frame.
Yeah. So I keep thinking, it's like, well, how would that be? You know, how would that happen now? You know, how would people break the machines now? Would they? You know, and I'm sure there are people breaking the machines. Yet, how many people in here don't have a smartphone? Put your hands up.
So everyone here has a smartphone.
So you know, it's incredibly like seductive and powerful that people are saying. You know, we were saying earlier on about disruption. We were talking about the disruptive nature and chaos in government and so on. I was like, oh, I like
he was actually complaining that that everything was a bit in flux and a bit unpredictable, and he wanted it all to be more settled. And I was saying, I thought you guys were all about disruption.
That's right.
But apparently
the right
not.
Sort,
it's just like
the right
that
sort.
much disruption. Anything else, really.
Yeah. But so it is interesting, and the thing that keeps bringing me back to the positive power of technology here, as well as its seductive nature, is the fact that, you know, I've always liked technology. I'm happy to admit to that. You know, I've drunk the Kool-Aid. You know, but I when I work in my practice, you know, I'm at home and I'm using these technologies. I know what you mean. That, you know, you sell a certain degree of it, but there is no doubt that the technology that I was using 10 years ago at home is still vastly ahead of the technology I used. You know, I was going back decades when I went into my practice, you know. I mean, literally in some cases, you know, we're still using fax machines, of course. You know, we were operating Windows XP until a couple of years ago, kind of thing. You know, there's this pressure that builds up about why is it that so many things in my world work so well with technology, and I'm happy to accept that. Yet when I go and receive my healthcare, it is so different. You know, as a doctor, when I try and deliver healthcare, it is so different, and it's frustrating when, you know, you have all this work in front of you, and you're like, look, I really, really want to be able to help my patients to the best of my ability, but you know, the tools that I use at home, which I use fantastically well, I cannot use here, and patients turn around and say, why can't you do it? Why can't I email you? You know, why can't I WhatsApp you? I know this is not for everyone, but it's completely reasonable that a person might be able to use a tool that they use at home to speak to the doctor. I don't think healthcare is so uniquely different that it cannot adopt this technology. Should you just dump all the technology on top of it? No. Should we be careful about how this is done? Yes. Are there some technologies that are maybe, you know, you need to take more care over in certain sectors? Absolutely. But I don't know, if we don't address this, that gap gets bigger, that pressure gets greater.
Yeah.
And those people that maybe, you know, we would hope that healthcare specialists and clinicians need to be involved in this discussion. Otherwise, it's going to be dictated for them and then for their patients too.
I think I would say that resistance is quite different from refusal. So the thing I get slagged off for most from my work sort of on Twitter is that I'm a sort of techno fetishist who actually loves technology too much, and you know, so obviously there's a real sort of, but I'm very interested in repurposing technologies. So how can we use the tools that we have to hand and put them to different uses? How can we change the way that we are engaging or using technologies as well as changing the way that we develop them? So I like to think in terms of, you need to think like a hacker and think like an engineer. So you need to think about how do these existing technologies work now? How can we turn them to more emancipatory uses? And how can we actually get a seat at the table, you know, in terms of developing these technologies in a more emancipatory way to start with, instead of having to reclaim them or redirect them? How can we shape the way that they're being developed?
That's right, and it was interesting the point that you're making about, you know, in different communities. I mean, one of the things that, you know, you look at how technology has opened up the ability to broadcast to the world, to anyone that has the ability to just access an internet browser with YouTube and podcasting and so on and so forth. And you would hope that as technologies develop in AI, I know we're focusing on AI just here, that the ability for anyone to be able to use those tools to allow them to, affect their world around them, you would hope that that would be the case, that it was released to them as well. One of the finest things that I enjoy is being able to give these tools to patients. I don't want to have control over them. If I can, one of the best things, I use VR for patients for their pain. I absolutely love it when they just can use it themselves and they don't have to come to me. I don't want to have to say whether a person can or cannot control their pain. I'm delighted that they can do this themselves. The We Are Not Waiting movement for patients with diabetes, another classic example, using the tools that are available to them to connect, to do what the companies won't do, to connect their continuous glucose monitors to their automatic insulin pumps and create an artificial pancreas of their own, run it themselves, done by patients, for patients, wonderful use of technology in those things. So maybe that's closer to...
There's also
before this gets to be too much of a love-in over here, I do want to come back out and give you, have one more round out here, but before that, I just wanted to give you a chance, especially, I mean, this is a really interesting comment of whether work will actually just come to mean something completely different.
Yeah, and actually I really wanted to go back to the question about education and also inequalities. Because those are something that we did touch on the report, and I thought would be very interesting to share with the audience today. So it was a really interesting approach that you raised about using AI for learning and some of these online courses. How could they be maybe automated to kind of battle the whole issue of workforce retraining? But actually something that we found is that there seems to be three most important points in a person's life in terms of retraining and learning. And you do have kind of the basic education, higher education, the workforce retraining that we have been talking about already. But it's also the really, really early years of a very young baby or a toddler where you have like a kind of close connection with them. And that's something that's going to really develop those socio-emotional and cognitive skills, as well as some of these skills of just not taking for granted what you learn, but to be able to relearn and forget what you have learned previously. So there are those different points that maybe the AI solution wouldn't actually kind of work across all of those. And then just to link back to that kind of idea of having to forget and then relearn as the labor market is changing and the inequalities that you pointed out. I'm thinking that it's maybe not necessarily about exposure to AI, but to have this ability to kind of retrain yourself. So something that we talk about in the report is kind of the specific case of millennials and the generation that comes after that, because while they are sort of largely digitally native and also very highly educated, they face quite a difficult situation in the labor market because many of them would have started their first jobs after the financial crisis, which is hard for everyone, but especially for people that are just starting to build their work histories there. So that's something that for them, you might be looking to work in a job or in a task that hasn't been created by the time that you are doing your education in school. So that whole skill of being able to forget and relearn is something really crucial that I think the educational systems will just have to be able to incorporate in order to meet that sustainably.
Okay, now we're kind of starting to run out of time. So what I'm going to do is I will try and take everybody that wants to say something. Please be as brief as you can. And I will jot some notes down. And then I will basically ask the panel to answer what you can, but also sum up. And if we don't manage to answer everything, then apologies. So there's a hand at the back, so let's start there. And if you want to start that one here at the end of this row, and we will kind of converge. And there are hands over here, so I will get to you. Yeah. Who's out there?
Thank you. First of all, I just want to echo the problem that we have with society and greed, and I think the real problem here is concentrating the wealth in the hands of the few if we're not careful. But what I really want to get on is to health, and I have a real concern that whilst everything that Keith has said sounds very good and is sounds like the right way forward, I have a great concern that we're trying to run before we can walk, and that there are an awful lot of technologies which could be very usefully employed, which are almost being leapfrogged by this sort of rush to AI and replacing doctors. And I think there's a huge amount to learn from the aircraft industry. And the aircraft industry has shown par excellence that if you actually automate too fast and you don't include humans in the loop, disasters happen.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So somebody here has the microphone, and anything else you'd like to work your way down to, I think that person there with the beard. Perfect. Yeah.
Just a question about whether the panel regards the drive for efficiency being the thing that drives AI, or the drive for effectiveness.
Very good and admirably concise. That's what we like. So if you'd like to go for it, and if you'd like to work your way up here and then actually over to here, I'm afraid if you've already said something, we've probably got time to come back to you, but I'll see how we get on. Yeah. That.
My question's about the state of the art of AI. So where is it relative to the Turing test? Would the chatbot pass the Turing test, and what's beyond the Turing test?
Oh, would it pass the Turing test, or are we even still concerned with whether it can fool us? There's another hand right next to that one, actually. Let's go there. Yes, who's got the... Yeah.
Hi, guys. My question's a bit contrarian. A few years back, early part of this decade, a lot of the talk was about big data. We don't hear about big data anymore. In the last few years, we've been starting to talk about artificial intelligence, and it's been going on with the tech industry, with the media, and so on. And I just want to say one very quick thing is last year I was here when Gary Kasparov came in May, and he'd written a brilliant book called Deep Thinking and Why It Matters. When machine ends and human creativity begins, something like that. But what Kasparov had said was interesting. He said when he lost to Deep Blue back in 1997, Newsweek's front cover was humans extinct. And he said, he asked people how many people had a chess app on your phone, and a lot of people put their hands up. And he said, what if I told you that your smartphone is now faster than Deep Blue? And he said, we're still here. So that's one thing. And another thing...
so you probably only get one thing. You've got one sentence if you want to slip
sure. One of the things he asked is, how come if artificial intelligence can do everything, why doesn't Facebook just have artificial intelligence to find all these inflammatory posts instead of hiring 4,000 people for it? Thanks.
Okay, good. Yes, so somebody's got the thing there, and keep your hands up so we know where this is going. Okay, so I'd like to come round to... No, yeah,
my question is about genomic data into healthcare. Would it even be possible to have it into the clinical routine without AI?
Very good point. Genomic data, and could we have it at all without AI? Yeah.
Actually, mine's not really really a question. It's just a scenario that occurred to me. I actually think AI is a good idea, but I'm concerned about an adult male, say, in his 40s or 50s, who works on a production line. Let's call him Bob. Bob loses his job because his production line has been automated. All the other production lines, which is the only thing he's capable of doing in the area, have closed down as well because they've been automated. He then is advised that why don't you do a massive open online course? But in the meantime, Bob's been to a party and someone said to him, what do you do for a living? And he's had to say no for nothing for the first time in his life. And so he's feeling very low, very invalidated, and can't really say that he's actually got anything to define who he is. He goes to this, he then starts this course, and he's sitting alone by himself, working on a course, no one to talk to, no one to discuss it with. He's getting more and more miserable, but it's okay because he's got his smartphone, which is the only bit of AI he's in control of. He gets on the smartphone, he makes an appointment with his doctor, is interfaced with Babylon, who tells him he's depressed. And I just really worry about what we do about people like that, because I think they will be legion, because these people have not been taught to think for themselves, to be creative. And I think what you actually need to do is start this at source in the schools and teach children about resilience, about being creative, and about thinking outside the box, and about starting their own businesses. And I think you need to carry on with that when anybody, anywhere is made redundant. And I do also wonder whether at the end of the day money is going to become irrelevant. It's about what role do you have in society rather than what your job is, because people won't have jobs.
Great, thank you very much. And if you'd like to take this microphone now and start moving over this side, and yeah, go for it.
My question is about gender. So we've talked a lot about polarisation, but I wondered if you could comment a bit more about the specific implications for things like gender pay gaps, whether AI will exacerbate or help those things.
Very good and pithy question. Yeah, good.
And mine kind of neatly follows on from that. My question is around the concept of rubbish in, rubbish out. And I just wanted to pose a question to the panel. Are all parts of the world something that we want AI to learn from?
So where do we want the data to come from that teaches the AI? Very good point. Who's got the microphone now?
Hi. Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. My question follows on from that about, does AI give us the opportunity to create fair attribution based on value from data, given that we can, with smart buildings and smarter environments, assess how much resource we each use? So can we then use AI to regulate the value from that better, to be fairer in how we attribute? Sorry, I'm not explaining it very well, but it's this idea of data attribution. If we have very quantified data about usage, for example, energy usage, could we then use AI to allocate things more fairly?
So you're thinking of, like, instead of using money to buy and sell things as the measure of who gets what, actually everything we do and use could be measured by AI in the environment. And so we could, in effect, have resources allocated and measured and accounted for just automatically by the surroundings.
Yeah, does it give us that opportunity? Yeah.
Great, another massive question. I like it when the massive questions come out. I can't promise we'll answer them all. Were there any other hands that have not been? Okay, yes, in the middle there. And then I will let the panel answer everything. Yeah, blue T-shirt, there you go. You get the last word from the audience, so make it really good, no pressure.
Over the last 100 years, technology and an increase in the global population have kind of gone hand in hand. Will AI make things so good that maybe we'll start to plateau and reduce our population?
Oh, interesting. So will we... Does that connect with the fact that we won't need everyone to work, do you think? Yes. Okay, good. So there you go, panel. We have loads of questions there. Where are we at? Would current AI pass the Turing test? Again, because you've come to an event on AI, I'm kind of assuming everyone knows the Turing test, but just in case not, Turing had this idea that the way you would assess whether a machine had intelligence was if it could be in another room and fool you that it was human, which is actually what IBM Watson was kind of designed to do, but they thought they'd get it to win a game show on TV instead. That is genuinely what they said. Could we design, after Deep Blue, where do we go next? Could we design an AI that would pass the Turing test? And then they went, actually, you know what? If we could get it to win Jeopardy, which is a game show on American TV with quite a tricky use of human language, they said if we could get it to win that, that would be like probably about the same level and much better for publicity purposes. To be cynical about it. Anyway, it did win. So good old Watson. So we've got that. We've got the health, the danger that we're trying to leapfrog technologies we could use now to go for all out for the AI. We've got the, is it efficiency or effectiveness that we're going for? The question about, well, okay, yeah, we keep hearing about big data. Listen, I haven't made my advance back on the book yet, so don't let's say it's gone out of fashion yet. Big data, AI, but Kasparov's still here, and we all have smartphones with chess apps, but still humans are still here. Genomic data, would it even be of any use with that AI? What happens to Bob, who's lost his production line job, and the answer is to do a MOOC on his own in his room, and he rings his doctor up, and the doctor says, yes, you're depressed. Are we going about this completely the wrong way? What about the gender pay gap? What about rubbish in, rubbish out? Are we getting the data from the right place? Could we use AI much more ambitiously to replace the market as a way of allocating resources? And what about the future of population? So there, I think that's kind of covered all of human life pretty much there. And we're now getting to the point where we need to answer all these questions and then go to the bar. So panel, what I'm going to do is, all right, I'm going to take you basically in the same order you spoke first. And I'd like you to answer any of those questions you feel you can and say anything else you'd like to say to wind up. Apologies in advance. We're not going to answer everything. We'll have to discuss it informally in the bar afterwards. But if you could do all that in, say, 3 minutes, that would be perfect. How's that? Is that okay?
That sounds good.
Good,
yeah,
off you go.
Definitely. So, yeah, I really like the question about the point of concentrating the wealth. I think that's absolutely key in this discussion. So, as I was mentioning in my brief 5-minute starter, so beyond that first source of inequality of labor market polarization or kind of hollowing out of the jobs in the middle, that's another really huge source of inequality that as you kind of have the capital that is in charge of the AI technologies, as you are cutting out the labor that used to be doing those jobs, you are then concentrating the wealth in the hands of this capital. And so it's very difficult and important to think about what does that mean for the labor, what does it mean for productivity, competitiveness, and also income. So I don't have an answer, I wish we did, but that's something really important to keep asking about. So maybe just to kind of very briefly wrap it up from my side is that that's exactly the kind of question that is about AI, yes, but it's also about the society's response and trying to figure a way of kind of managing these new technologies. So as we have discussed before, there are lots of different policy responses that might work in different contexts very differently. But I think that the idea that is taking place in a lot of these global discussions is that this is a new situation and we probably will need to adjust the way that we have governed things before, maybe even find completely new ways of dealing with the changing world of work. So I'm really glad to see that all of you have been part of this discussion here today, because I think it's really important that all of us keep asking these questions and keep pushing on that information to be out there and then feature into the high-level policy discussions as well. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. Naomi, if you could just answer all of those questions and then sum up, that'd be great.
There's a lot there. I just want to pick up on a couple of points. Firstly, just to reiterate this point about the importance of early years and investing in the early years, and about kind of teaching children kind of creative skills and transferable skills. That's absolutely fundamental. I think there's this issue more generally about how we keep pace with these changes as they're playing out, and how we understand the impacts that they're having, because we're sat here trying to predict how these things are going to play out. We need to know, kind of real time, how they are affecting people, communities, and the world of work more generally. And I think that's where the point about big data can actually be really quite informative in terms of understanding how the world of work is changing. And I think there's some really interesting kind of examples of quite innovative use of big data to understand these things. I think too is the importance of working with businesses and employers as well, to keep pace of these things. And the story of Bob kind of sitting on his own, doing his online training course. Actually, we know from the evidence that work-based training and learning is far more effective. So again, it's about kind of working with employers and businesses to design courses. We know from kind of past evidence that, courses that focused on kind of IT skills and kind of technology are much more effective when they're designed with employers in the IT sector, because they can, inform training providers of the types of skills and technologies that are actually much more kind of obsolete and where they should focus their effort. I think, in terms of retraining more generally, we do need to kind of keep pace with demand and understand how that's changing. There's an interesting example of Janesville in the US, where there were a huge number of redundancies when General Motors closed. And Amy Goldstein talks about the experience of workers who were made redundant through that process. And lots of them went on to find other jobs. But lots of them went on, to kind of retrain in the local college, a lot of them doing kind of 2-year courses. And by the time they came out of those 2-year courses, the jobs that they had been training for didn't exist. Or at least, there wasn't the demand that, they thought that there would be. So kind of finding ways to kind of keep pace with these changes as they're playing out, I think is really important. I think that's partly about the use of big data and kind of trying to find ways to improve our intelligence on these things. But it's also, as I'd say, kind of one final plug for the kind of role of cities and local partners in helping to kind of navigate some of these changes and impacts.
Brilliant, thanks. Keith?
There was a couple of questions in there. It's been a brilliant night. Thank you for putting some of these questions through. I mean, every part of them you could spend some time on. I suppose there's a couple of questions that came from the audience that are helpful for me to answer. The first one was about genomic data and whether genomic data could be used in healthcare without significant input from artificial intelligence. I think the short answer to that is no, mainly because the amount of data, the big data that comes from genomic studies requires machine learning and artificial intelligence to make sense of it, and not only make sense of it and present, even just to get accurate data requires machine learning, and then to use that information and present it in a way that humans can act on requires input from machines too. That doesn't even go into what you then do with the doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals that don't have the existing skill set to interpret that in a way that's helpful to patients as well. There's a lot of complexity in that, but the short answer to that is no, you're going to need some AI for that then. And then the second part was about the idea about the pace of technology in healthcare specifically. It's interesting. I mean, I hear people use the phrase about running before we can walk an awful lot with regards to the pace of change. And it's particularly telling for me because I've worked for a while in healthcare, not as long as many as well, but I've seen healthcare not even try to walk when it comes with technology. Are there technologies that could be employed ahead of AI that would make things significantly better? Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we start with email? there's so many simple technologies, but the thing is that each of these technologies has their appropriate uses at appropriate times, and technology races on as well. So it becomes difficult to know exactly which one to use where. Certainly, I would be totally delighted if within the NHS that we had the fundamentals right, that we had the right technology and that we had the right infrastructure, that didn't take 10 minutes to boot up a computer and have lots of different passwords on different screens. Absolutely, I would love that. But then we come back to it, are we replacing doctors? Is that the mission? That is absolutely not the mission. Does anyone think we have enough doctors in the UK right now? Have we got too many doctors in the UK right now? Well, we clearly don't. We're short. We're short of GPs. That's the area that I'm interested in. I would like to hazard a guess that in the UK, we will never have enough doctors. We will never have enough doctors, and that's in a really quite wealthy, developed nation. If you look globally, the chances of providing enough doctors or healthcare workers to provide healthcare around the world, it's not going to happen with humans. And I refuse to be part of a world where we don't try and address people's healthcare needs simply because we can't provide enough people to do it. We have to find the right use of people in here as well. And then when it comes about running before we can walk in the aircraft industry, of course, people do a lot of parallels between the aircraft industry and medicine as well. They're not exactly the same, but the aircraft industry has taught the healthcare industry a lot about how to practice safely. In fact, clinical governance comes principally from the aircraft industry as well. And it is true that technology is not always used, but remember, the aircraft industry started with someone running and jumping and taking an enormous risk. And from that, we have an entire industry. And there are times when we shouldn't do that in healthcare, absolutely. But I want to dream about being able to provide healthcare to everyone. I want to run. I don't want to be told that we can't even walk or we should walk in a certain way. We should be able to aspire to help everyone with this. And is AI an important tool to do this? Yes, absolutely. We have to do it right, of course. But it's got to be part of the answer.
So here we have the Wright brothers of AI and healthcare. Helen,
yeah,
you'd like to sum up everything in 3 minutes flat.
No,
that'd be great.
I wouldn't. I won't even try. One thing I will say is that how I'm quite pleased that the Turing test kind of came up, because it's sort of, with the Mechanical Turk, it's kind of one of the two sort of great primal scenes of artificial intelligence for me, right? So the Mechanical Turk, not in the Amazon sense, but the chess-playing automaton, 17th century, I think, that was actually was thought to be sort of super slick, really impressive, but was actually like a man inside it, moving it around, making it seem like it was technologically advanced. And then the Turing test. And what's really interesting to me as a techno-feminist, and you'll excuse me if I go off in a massive rant here, is that the Turing test has this neglected gender element in it, where actually in Turing's paper, he's talking about a version of a parlor game where you have a man and a woman who, it's like a binary gender guessing game, where the man has to convince the person who's kind of performing the test that he's the woman, and the woman has to convince him that she's a woman as well. And then so Turing's version is about a bot and a woman, I think, competing to be the most convincing woman. So there's a really interesting kind of dynamic in there. So because what you were talking about in terms of what would pass the Turing test, I'm working on a paper at the moment that's looking at like feminized chatbots. And in particular, Tay. I don't know if people remember Tay, Microsoft's ill-fated Twitter bot, who had some original content that was written by comedians and by sort of editorial team, but also largely a product of an existing data set that was kind of swept up from Twitter and interactions with users. And so inevitably, garbage in, garbage out, she ended up spouting these kind of Nazi slogans and, just being aggressively un-PC, because she had been sort of deliberately, her parroting function had been sort of deliberately sabotaged. Now, what I think is quite interesting is that Microsoft, to begin with, decided to make Tay a millennial girl. So very particularly, they decided Tay was going to be a teenage girl. And perhaps one really easy way to cheat the Turing test, or to at least seem like you're doing a better job of playing the imitation game than perhaps you are, is to pretend to be marked by difference from the norm in some way. So AI, which has been sort of pretending to be a non-native speaker, has passed the Turing test in the past. So if you want to produce a convincing impression of imitation, like drawing upon a subgroup that doesn't quite count as human to begin with is a pretty good move. And what doesn't quite count as human is a teenage girl. You know, you see this in all these claims about the effectiveness of teenage girls' language. So their use of slang, their use of emojis, vocal fry, which is like that sort of Kardashian drawl, upspeak, which is where you sort of finish every sentence as if it's a question. And so there's already the ability of teenage girls to communicate is already strongly culturally disparaged. So already it becomes easier to imitate that because the slips and the errors all become part of being seen as this sort of millennial teen package. But it kind of goes further than this. It's not just that girls are viewed as being more artificial than other humans, but it's that the AI that was meant to replicate these women is seen as being more human than they are, if we take the human as a kind of bundle of of rights and opportunities. So what I'm arguing is that intelligence might be more visible when it comes from a bot than when it comes from a woman. So if there was, as soon as Microsoft decided to shut down Tay, there was an uproar. It was censorship, they were killing her, there were petitions, what about her rights, etc., etc. So this literal parroting of material by a bot was viewed as an intelligence in need of protection, whereas women who are trying to navigate the internet every day are told that they're making a fuss about nothing and they should shut the fuck up. So I just think that there's a very interesting extension of this sort of flipping of status that I've been talking about throughout this whole thing. The human worker versus the AI, what registers as an intelligence? That is a very human question and one that we need to kind of turn a self-critical lens on. And then just to finish with society and greed, I was inevitably going to come back to that. I think ownership is really important, the ownership of these technologies. I think we need to think about the black boxing of these technologies that makes them impenetrable. You know, we need to be pushing for corporate transparency about these things. We need to be arguing against the proprietorial stance that's being taken towards them and advocating for the right to repair. You know, at this stage, if something is broken, we're not allowed to touch it. We can't take it to an unauthorized vendor. It will void our warranty. You know, there's a lot of people out there in that sort of techno-Luddite vein arguing for new ways of engaging with technologies. And I think we need to be starting to sort of lobbying around that at grassroots level if we don't want to just concentrate wealth in the hands of the already super wealthy.
Fantastic. On that note, can I ask you to thank our wonderful panel? And thank you all for really, really interesting contributions. So we didn't answer all the massive questions, but if we all go to the bar, unless you're watching it at home on the internet, in which case I'm sorry you've missed it, because we've already been to the bar, but you'll have to email somebody or something. But the rest of us, let's go to the bar and see if we can answer the really massive questions. Thank you.